Something was wrong with the ground. In the summer of 1795, on a small island in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, a teenager named Daniel McGinnis noticed a circular depression in the earth beneath an old oak tree. The soil had settled in a way that soil does not settle on its own. Above it, a tackle block hung from a severed branch, as though something heavy had once been lowered into the space below. McGinnis returned with two friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and they began to dig. What they found was not treasure, it was architecture. Every 10 feet, the boys struck a platform of oak logs, laid horizontally across the shaft and fitted tightly into the clay walls. They dug through one platform, then another, each deliberately placed, until the depth exceeded what 3 teenagers could manage with shovels and daylight. They stopped at roughly 30 feet. Whatever lay beneath the next platform, they could not reach alone. This is the official beginning, the story that launched over 2 centuries of excavation, 6 recorded deaths, and an expenditure of labor and capital that defies rational accounting. Every major attempt to reach the bottom of what became known as the Money Pit has followed the same essential logic those 3 boys established in 1795, go deeper. And yet, across all those years, no one has reached a confirmed bottom. No vault has been opened. No definitive artifact has been recovered from the central shaft. The pit has flooded, collapsed, been re-drilled, bored through, and scanned with modern instruments, and still it offers nothing final. Only more layers, only more wood and clay and silence. The question that should trouble us is not what lies at the bottom. It is simpler than that, and far more uncomfortable. Why has a hole that so many people have entered never once produced a verifiable floor? The boys told others. Others came with money, and for 2 centuries after, the money never stopped coming. By 1804, the Unsolved Company had formed the first organized syndicate to pour capital into Oak Island. They dug to 90 feet. They found layers of charcoal, putty, and coconut fiber at regular intervals. Then, at approximately 98 feet, the shaft flooded. Seawater surged in faster than any pump could manage, and the dig collapsed into waterlogged ruin. The Unsolved Company went bankrupt. The island went quiet, but not for long. What followed was not a single story, but a pattern. The Truro Company arrived in 1849 and drilled core samples that allegedly brought up small fragments of gold chain and parchment. The Oak Island Association dug again in the 1860s, losing 1 worker to a boiler explosion. Frederick Blair secured a treasure trove license in 1893 and spent decades drilling and theorizing without resolution. Robert Ristall arrived in 1959 with his family. In 1965, he descended into a shaft, was overcome by fumes, and died. His son followed him down and died beside him. 2 others died attempting rescue. 4 men in a single afternoon. And still, no one reconsidered the fundamental premise. The Tri-Sun Alliance brought industrial equipment and corporate financing in the 1970s. They sank a steel caisson to over 200 feet and lowered a camera into a void that appeared to show wooden chests and abandoned tools. The footage was inconclusive. Dan Blankenship, one of the lead partners, nearly died in a collapse. The project stalled indefinitely. The Logina brothers arrived in 2006, eventually building an entire television franchise around the continuing search. Each generation inherited the last generation's maps, theories, and unfinished shafts. Each assumed the previous one had simply not dug far enough or spent enough. No one paused to ask whether the direction itself, downward into Oak Island, was the correct one. What if every expedition failed not because they lacked resources, but because they were solving the wrong problem entirely? There is a phenomenon that behavioral economists call the sunk cost trap. The more you invest in a course of action, the harder it becomes to abandon, not because the evidence supports continuing, but because walking away means admitting the investment was wasted. The trap does not require stupidity. It requires exactly the kind of intelligence that builds theories, interprets ambiguous data, and finds reasons to keep going. Oak Island is perhaps the longest running sunk cost trap in the Western Hemisphere. Every failed dig has produced just enough ambiguity to justify the next one. A scrap of parchment, a fragment of chain, a carved stone no one can locate anymore. These are not proof of treasure. They are proof of activity. And activity is not the same thing as progress. But when you have spent decades or millions or buried your dead on a small island in Nova Scotia, the difference between activity and progress becomes very difficult to see. The mythology reinforces itself. Each generation's failure becomes the next generation's evidence. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to bury something because look how hard it is to reach. The difficulty of excavation becomes the argument for its value. The absence of results becomes proof that the treasure must be deeper, more significant than imagined. No one asks the simpler question. No one stands at the edge of the money pit and wonders whether the entire structure was built not to protect something below, but to ensure that people kept looking below, endlessly, expensively, and in the wrong place. This documentary is not about what is buried on Oak Island. It is about what might be buried somewhere else, somewhere close, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one has looked, because Oak Island made sure they never would. That question will not be answered here, but it will be built piece by piece until its shape becomes difficult to ignore. Before Oak Island had a name, before Nova Scotia had a colony, and before the Atlantic had been officially crossed by any European vessel on record, something happened in France that left a permanent scar on European power. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Knight Templar in France. The coordinated strike was unprecedented in medieval governance. Sealed warrants delivered weeks in advance, opened at dawn across the kingdom, executed with military precision. The charges were heresy, blasphemy, and obscene ritual. The evidence was extracted under torture. The confessions were dictated before the questions were asked. Within weeks, the most powerful military religious order in Christendom had been dismantled. Its leaders were imprisoned. Its assets were seized. Pope Clement V, under direct pressure from the French crown, issued a papal bull dissolving the order entirely by 1312. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. But here is where the official narrative develops a fracture that no historian has fully repaired. The Templar fleet, a substantial naval force headquartered at the port of La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast, was never seized. On the night before the arrests, or in the days immediately following, the fleet vanished. Ships that had been documented in harbor simply were not there when the king's men arrived. No manifest survived. No destination was recorded. No wreckage was ever found along any known coastline. Philip got the men. He got the land. He got the banking infrastructure. But whatever those ships carried out of La Rochelle, gold, documents, relics, or simply men who knew things the crown wanted buried, disappeared into the Atlantic. The official historical position is that the fleet likely scattered to existing Templar allies around the Mediterranean. But the Mediterranean was hostile territory in 1307. Papal authority reached every port. If the fleet sailed west into open Atlantic water, the question becomes not whether they could survive the crossing. The question is what they were carrying and where they intended to take it. The written history of Nova Scotia begins, depending on which authority you trust, with John Cabot in 1497 or the French establishment of Port Royal in 1605. Before that, the official record is silence, a coastline without a European story attached to it. But the Mi'kmaq, the indigenous people who have inhabited this land for thousands of years, have stories that do not align neatly with that silence. Their oral traditions include accounts of visitors arriving by sea long before the colonial period, pale men in strange vessels, encounters that left physical marks on the landscape but no entries in any European chronicle. These traditions are often dismissed as myth or misidentified memory. That dismissal is convenient because it preserves the clean boundary between pre-contact and post-contact history. But oral traditions among indigenous peoples have been shown repeatedly and across cultures to preserve accurate accounts of events stretching back centuries. Dismissing them requires assuming they are wrong. Trusting them requires asking who came to Nova Scotia before the record says anyone did. And then there are the stones. Scattered across Nova Scotia, and particularly along the southern coastline near Mahone Bay, are rock carvings and stone arrangements that do not fit comfortably into any indigenous tradition. Some bear resemblance to European crosses. Others display geometric patterns that have been compared cautiously to Templar or pre-Columbian Christian symbolism. None have been definitively dated, none have been conclusively attributed. They exist in an interpretive gap, too unusual to ignore, too ambiguous to prove anything, and so they remain unclaimed by any narrative, sitting quietly in the granite while the world argues about what is buried under Oak Island, just a few miles away. Whoever carved those marks knew this coastline intimately. The question is when they arrived and what they left behind that was not made of stone. The idea that the Knights Templar reached Oak Island did not begin with evidence. It began with an absence, a gap in the record where something should be but is not. And into that gap, a theory moved and has refused to leave. The connection was first proposed on the fringes of alternative history in the mid-20th century. Writers drew a speculative line from the vanished Templar fleet at La Rochelle to the construction on Oak Island, arguing that the engineering of the money pit required exactly the institutional knowledge the Templars possessed. The theory gained traction not because it was proven, but because it could not be conclusively disproven. The fleet did disappear. The pit does exist. The gap between those two facts has never been filled by conventional history. Mainstream historians have responded with justified skepticism. There is no documentary evidence linking the Templars to North America. No artifact from Oak Island bears confirmed Templar provenance. The engineering of the money pit, they argue, can be explained by later colonial activity, perhaps a British military operation, perhaps a privateering cache. The Templar theory in this view is romantic nonsense grafted onto an already inflated mystery. And yet the theory persists, not because its believers are irrational, but because the skeptics have left something unaddressed. Historians who dismiss the Templar connection rarely engage with the larger question beneath it. They explain why the Templars probably did not build the money pit. They do not explain where the fleet went. They do not explain what happened to the order's accumulated records, navigational charts, and financial reserves. They do not explain the gap. Rejecting a theory is not the same as answering the question the theory was built to address. until someone offers a better explanation for where the fleet sailed and what it carried. The Templar theory will continue to occupy the silence that mainstream history has chosen not to fill. The theory survives not on evidence, it survives on the absence of a better answer. There is a detail about the money pit that is often cited as proof of its importance, but examined carefully proves something else entirely. At approximately 100 feet below the surface, early excavators encountered a catastrophic flood. Seawater filled the shaft faster than any pump could remove it. Later investigations suggested the cause was a system of flood tunnels, channels running from Smith's Cove to the pit, designed so that digging below a certain depth would trigger irreversible inundation. The tunnels were reportedly lined with coconut fiber and eelgrass, functioning as filtration that allowed water in while keeping sediment out. If this engineering is real and the evidence remains debated, it represents an extraordinary investment. Whoever built the flood tunnels understood hydrostatic pressure, tidal mechanics, and subterranean water management at a level that implies institutional knowledge and significant labor. This was not improvisation. But here is the contradiction no one addresses directly enough. Why would anyone construct such an elaborate defensive mechanism and then leave nothing retrievable behind it? Every modern scan, every core sample, every camera lowered into the flooded depths has failed to confirm the existence of a vault, a chest, or even a sealed chamber. The engineering says something valuable was protected. The absence says nothing. Valuable remains. These two facts do not sit well together unless you allow for a third possibility, that the engineering was never designed to protect a treasure, that the flood tunnels were built to ensure the pit would always flood, would always resist excavation, would always draw people back. Engineering that protects nothing is not failed security. It is a mechanism with a different purpose. Of all the anomalies recovered from Oak Island, coconut fiber may be the most quietly destabilizing. It was found in substantial quantities, not as a trace element, but as a structural component woven into the fill material of the money pit and reportedly packed into the flood tunnels at Smith's Cove. Coconut fiber does not exist naturally in Nova Scotia. It does not grow within several thousand miles of Mahone Bay. Its presence underground on a small island in the North Atlantic is, by any straightforward reading, impossible without human transport. This material has been used for decades to support the argument that Oak Island was the site of a sophisticated construction project. If someone brought coconut fiber to Nova Scotia, they came from the tropics or from a supply chain connecting to the tropics. That implies oceanic navigation, logistical planning, and resources beyond a pirate burying a chest. The fiber suggests an operation, not an act, and most investigators have stopped their analysis right there. Coconut fiber proves the pit was built by someone with long-range maritime capability. Therefore, the pit must be important. Therefore, the treasure must be inside. But that conclusion skips a step. Coconut fiber confirms that someone with significant resources traveled a great distance and built something here. It does not confirm that the money pit was the primary thing they built. It does not confirm the pit is a vault. It confirms construction. It confirms effort. It confirms presence. But it tells us nothing about purpose. Consider the possibility: a group with oceanic reach, engineering expertise, and access to tropical materials arrives in Mahone Bay and constructs a deep shaft filled with layered platforms, flood defenses, and organic fill. The shaft consumes enormous labor. It is visible. It is findable. It is precisely the kind of structure that would attract attention for centuries. Now consider that the same group could have built something else nearby, something smaller, quieter, and invisible. The coconut fiber does not point toward the money pit as a vault. It points toward the people who built it. And people with those resources rarely build only one thing. If you have spent time studying the Knights Templar, not the mythologized version, not the Hollywood Crusaders, but the operational order as it functioned across 2 centuries, one characteristic emerges above all others. They understood secrecy not as a single act, but as layered architecture. Templar commanderies across Europe and the Levant used compartmentalized knowledge structures. Lower-ranking members knew only what their function required. Financial transactions were conducted through coded correspondence. The order maintained its own legal system, its own diplomatic channels, and its own communications network, one that operated parallel to and often invisible within the structures of church and crown. When the Templars hid something, they did not simply put it in a hole. They built systems around the hidden thing, false paths convincing enough to absorb an investigator's full attention. The goal was never merely to conceal, it was to control where people looked and to ensure that looking felt productive enough that no one thought to look elsewhere. Now apply that doctrine to Oak Island, a shaft elaborately engineered, filled with tantalizing layers at regular intervals, platforms suggesting descent toward something, flood tunnels that trigger when you get close, as though you are being repelled from a prize, just enough anomalous material, fiber, fragments, inscribed stones to sustain the belief that something lies below. The entire structure reads like an answer. The treasure is here. Keep digging. But what if the structure is not an answer? What if it is a question deliberately planted, designed to be asked over and over in the same location? The Templars did not build mysteries. They built systems of controlled attention. And such a system does not require a treasure at its center. It requires only the belief that a treasure might be there. If the money pit is a decoy and nothing recovered from it in 200 years contradicts that possibility, then the most important question is no longer what lies beneath Oak Island. It is what lies beside it. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolo Zeno the Younger published a map he claimed was based on letters and navigational charts left behind by his ancestors. 2 brothers who had allegedly sailed the North Atlantic in the 1390s. The map depicted Iceland, Greenland, and a series of coastlines to the west with an accuracy that, for the 14th century, should not have been possible. The Zeno map has been debated for nearly 500 years. Critics have called it a fabrication assembled from later sources and dressed in medieval provenance to flatter the Zeno family name. Supporters have pointed to specific coastal features, harbor shapes, island clusters, inlet angles, that correspond too closely to real geography to be the product of guesswork. The scholarly consensus has oscillated between outright dismissal and cautious interest, never fully settling in either direction. But the map's authenticity is not what matters here. What matters is what the map implies if even portions of it are genuine. If any section of the Zeno map accurately reflects North Atlantic coastlines as they were understood in the late 14th century, it means that someone possessed navigational knowledge of the region decades before Columbus and decades before any official European expedition ever reached those waters. That knowledge did not materialize from nothing. It came from actual voyages that were made, recorded, and then lost or suppressed. The Zeno map places detailed geographic knowledge in the hands of people who, according to the official historical record, had no reason to possess it. and the period it claims to depict, the 1390s, falls within the century immediately following the Templar suppression, when former members of the order and their maritime networks were dispersing across Europe and beyond. No serious historian claims the Zeno map is a Templar document, but no one has adequately explained who was sailing the North Atlantic with that level of geographic precision in the decades after the order vanished, and why those voyages left no other trace. The Knights Templar were not primarily a naval power, but they were, by necessity, a maritime one. The order maintained its own fleet, operated its own ports, and controlled shipping routes between Europe and the Levant for nearly 2 centuries. Their logistical network moved men, gold, horses, grain, and construction materials across the Mediterranean with a regularity that rivaled any commercial fleet of the era. This required navigational knowledge, and the Templars had access to the most advanced maritime cartography of their time, the Portolan charts. The Portolan charts were coastal maps of extraordinary precision, built from direct observation and compass bearings rather than theoretical geography. They first appeared in the late 13th century, concentrated in the Mediterranean, and their accuracy still surprises modern cartographers. The charts were closely held by maritime powers. They represented not just geography, but strategic advantage, knowledge of harbors, currents, shoals, and anchorages that could mean the difference between a successful voyage and a lost fleet. The Templars operated within this tradition. Their ships sailed regularly between southern France, the Iberian coast, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. Their navigational records were maintained internally within the order's own systems. Systems never surrendered to the Inquisition. When the arrests came in 1307, Philip's agents seized land, buildings, and financial instruments. They did not seize the fleet, and they did not seize the maritime archives. No Templar navigational chart has ever been recovered. No portolan bearing a Templar mark has surfaced in any European collection. The absence is conspicuous. An organization that operated ships across thousands of miles for 200 years left behind no maps, no sailing directions, no harbor logs. Either those documents were destroyed, which would require a deliberate act no one has documented, or they were carried away by the same fleet that vanished from La Rochelle. What the Templars knew about the Atlantic coastlines remains an unanswered question. The question is not whether medieval ships could cross the Atlantic. They could. Norse voyagers reached Newfoundland around the year 1000, and their vessels were no more advanced than what the Templars had access to 3 centuries later. The Atlantic was not an impassable barrier. It was a problem of navigation, provisioning, and will, all of which the Templars possessed in institutional abundance. The more precise question is whether a fleet leaving La Rochelle in the autumn of 1307 could have reached Nova Scotia. The answer, based on prevailing currents and wind patterns, is that the voyage would have been not only possible, but surprisingly efficient. The North Atlantic Gyre, the system of currents that circulates clockwise across the ocean, creates a natural corridor. A ship departing the French Atlantic coast and sailing northwest would encounter the North Atlantic Current, which bends toward Iceland and the coast of Greenland before curving south along the Labrador coast toward Nova Scotia. The same current system that carried Norse ships to Vinland would have carried Templar ships to Mahone Bay. Medieval sailing vessels of the type the Templars operated, cogs, galleys, and round ships, were capable of sustained ocean voyages when properly provisioned. The crossing from La Rochelle to Nova Scotia, following favorable currents, could have been completed in roughly 5 to 7 weeks. This is not speculation, it is marine archaeology applied to known vessel capabilities and documented ocean conditions. But here is where the map goes quiet. If the Templars could reach Nova Scotia, they could also reach any number of locations along that same coastline. Harbors in Newfoundland, bays in New Brunswick, and inlets along the main shore. Oak Island is one possibility among dozens. The currents do not point to a single destination. They point to a region, and within that region, the attention of the entire world has been fixed on a single small island, while virtually everything around it remains unexamined. The route is plausible, the destination is assumed, and that central assumption has never once been tested against the alternatives. Step back from Oak Island for a moment, not far, just far enough to see what surrounds it. Mahone Bay on the southern shore of Nova Scotia contains approximately 365 islands. The number has been cited so often it has become local shorthand, one island for every day of the year. Most are small, many are entirely uninhabited, some have never been surveyed. They sit in the cold Atlantic water like fragments of a sentence no one has bothered to read. Oak Island is one of these 365. It is not the largest. It is not the most geologically distinctive. It is not even particularly difficult to access. What makes it unique in the public imagination is not geography, but mythology. The story of the money pit, repeated and amplified across 2 centuries until the island became synonymous with buried treasure. But mythology is not cartography, and the question no one seems to ask is devastatingly simple. Has anyone actually looked at the other islands? The answer, with very few exceptions, is no. Archaeological survey work in Mahone Bay has been almost entirely confined to Oak Island. The surrounding islands, some within a few hundred meters, have received no systematic excavation, no ground-penetrating radar, no formal academic attention. They exist in a blind spot created not by geography but by narrative. If you were designing a hiding place, not just a hole, but a system of concealment meant to survive centuries, you would want exactly this environment. A cluster of islands so numerous that attention could be directed toward one while the others disappeared into administrative invisibility. 364 islands have been waiting in silence while the world watches the 365th. No one has asked them what they know. Oak Island's underground features have long been treated as proof that someone engineered something remarkable beneath its surface. The cavities, the voids, the unusual drainage patterns, all have been cited as evidence of deliberate human construction at depth. And perhaps some of them are. But geology offers an uncomfortable complication. Mahone Bay sits on a landscape shaped by glacial retreat. Approximately 10,000 years ago, the ice sheets that had covered Nova Scotia began to recede, leaving behind a terrain of drumlins, elongated hills of glacial till, and exposed bedrock riddled with natural fissures. The islands of Mahone Bay are, in geological terms, the tops of drumlins and bedrock ridges that were submerged as sea levels rose after the last ice age. This means the underground geometry of Oak Island is not unique, it is typical. The same limestone dissolution channels, the same tidal erosion cavities, the same natural voids that have been interpreted as tunnels or chambers on Oak Island exist on dozens of neighboring islands. The geology does not distinguish Oak Island from its surroundings. If anything, it connects them. This does not disprove human construction beneath Oak Island, but it introduces a possibility that most investigators have ignored. What if the builders, whoever they were, did not create the underground architecture from scratch? What if they selected an island whose natural geology already provided what they needed: cavities, drainage paths, and subsurface chambers formed by millennia of glacial and tidal action. And if they selected one island for its geology, what stopped them from selecting another? The same features that made Oak Island attractive as a construction site exist throughout the bay. The geological argument for Oak Island's uniqueness collapses the moment you examine the islands around it. Someone chose Oak Island. That choice was deliberate, but the geology suggests the reason for that choice was not exclusivity, it was abundance. There were many viable options, and the possibility that more than one site was used has never been formally investigated. In the late 20th century, side-scan sonar technology became widely available for underwater survey work. It allowed researchers to map the seafloor with acoustic pulses, revealing formations entirely invisible to divers and surface observers alike. Several surveys were conducted in the waters around Oak Island and across the broader expanse of Mahone Bay over the following decades. The results were carefully documented. What happened next, or rather what did not happen next, is the real story. The sonar data revealed anomalous formations on the seabed near several islands other than Oak Island, straight-edged shapes, rectangular patterns that were clearly inconsistent with known natural rock formations, linear structures at depths suggesting they had once been above water or at the shoreline before centuries of tidal erosion and gradual sea level change submerged them beneath the surface. These findings were noted in survey reports. They were not classified as archaeological discoveries because no follow-up investigation was ever conducted. No diver was sent down to verify. No excavation permit was filed. No academic institution requested access to the sites. The data sat in technical reports that circulated among a small number of researchers and were eventually filed away without further action. The reasons for this silence are not conspiratorial. They are structural. Funding for underwater archaeology in Nova Scotia is extremely limited and almost entirely directed toward known shipwreck sites or Oak Island itself. Research permits for new excavation sites require institutional backing that no university has volunteered to provide. Media interest, which drives much of the funding cycle, is concentrated exclusively on the money pit narrative. An anomalous sonar reading near an unnamed island simply does not generate headlines or attract sponsors, and so the formations remain unexamined. Shapes on a screen that might be natural bedrock or might be the remains of something built by people who understood that the best way to hide a structure is to place it where no one has any reason to look. The data exists, and then the shapes are recorded. The question is not whether the evidence is there. The question is why no one has walked through the door it opened. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not merely a seizure of assets. It was, in a very precise and deliberate sense, an act of erasure. When Philip IV moved against the order, his agents were given explicit instructions to confiscate everything, not just gold and property, but records, internal correspondence, financial ledgers, architectural plans, shipping manifests. The vast bureaucratic infrastructure of an organization that had operated across dozens of countries for nearly 2 centuries contained information that both the French crown and the papacy wanted firmly controlled. Some of it was used in the trials. A great deal of it was simply destroyed. How the Inquisition's treatment of Templar documents followed a deliberate and revealing pattern. Records that supported the prosecution were preserved and entered into evidence. Records that did not serve the narrative, operational logistics, trade routes, Construction orders, navigational documents were either burned or simply never cataloged. The Inquisition was not interested in what the Templars had built or where they had sailed. It was interested only in what they had believed and whom they had served. This means the documentary record of the Templars is not merely incomplete, it is selectively incomplete. The surviving archive tells us what the Templars were accused of. It tells us almost nothing about what they actually did operationally in the critical decades before the arrests, where they shipped materials, what they constructed, which routes their fleet traveled in the Atlantic. Historians who demand documentary proof of Templar activity in North America are demanding evidence from an archive that was deliberately mutilated. The absence of records is not a neutral fact. It is a direct consequence of a systematic campaign to destroy exactly the kind of documents that might answer the questions now being asked. To treat that absence as proof that the Templars never crossed the Atlantic is to trust the completeness of an archive that was designed to be incomplete. The silence in the record is not accidental. It was engineered, and what was burned cannot ever be cited, but neither can it be dismissed. There is one place in 14th century Europe where the Templar suppression did not function as intended. One kingdom where the papal bull dissolving the order was received, read, and effectively ignored: Scotland. In 1307, Robert the Bruce was fighting for Scottish independence. He had been excommunicated by Pope Clement V, the same pope who dissolved the Templars under direct pressure from Philip of France. Scotland, already at war with England and deeply estranged from papal authority, had no incentive whatsoever to enforce a decree from a pope who had condemned its king. The bull was not applied. The arrests were not carried out. The order within Scottish borders was simply left alone. This created something extraordinary and largely undocumented: a gap in the suppression. Templar knights fleeing France, England, and other territories where the order was being systematically dismantled had a destination. The Scotland offered sanctuary not as deliberate policy, but as a consequence of political circumstance. It simply did not enforce what Rome demanded. And here geography begins to whisper. Scotland sits at the northeastern edge of the Atlantic. From the Scottish coast, the crossing to Nova Scotia follows the shortest transatlantic route in the northern hemisphere. Island hopping through the Orkneys, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and down to the Labrador coast. This is the same route the Norse used centuries earlier. It requires no open ocean crossing of more than a few hundred miles. If fleeing Templars reached Scotland, and historical evidence confirms that some did, they had access to a maritime corridor leading directly to North America. They had ships, they had navigational knowledge, and they had resources the Crown of France never seized. The Scottish Gap is not proof that the Templars sailed west, but it is proof that the one place in Europe where they could have organized such a voyage was also the one place from which such a voyage was geographically simplest. That convergence has never been adequately explained or addressed. Rosslyn Chapel sits 15 miles south of Edinburgh. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, it has become the most heavily mythologized building in the Templar narrative, a site so saturated with symbolism and conspiracy that it functions less as architecture and more as an industry. The chapel's carvings include imagery interpreted as Templar crosses, Masonic symbols, and most controversially on depictions of plants native to the Americas, including what some researchers identify as maize and aloe, carved decades before Columbus sailed. If genuine, these carvings imply pre-Columbian contact between Scotland and the New World, lending weight to the theory that Templar-connected voyagers crossed the Atlantic long before the official age of exploration. The debate over Roslin's carvings has consumed enormous scholarly energy and generated no consensus. The identifications remain disputed. The dating remains contested. The chapel continues to attract visitors who arrive with theories and leave with confirmation of what they already believed. But here is the question this documentary is interested in. What if Roslin's greatest function is not what it reveals, but what it conceals? Not through its carvings, but through its sheer visibility. Roslin is loud, it is accessible. It absorbs unlimited attention precisely because it offers unlimited ambiguity. Every surface can be read, every symbol endlessly debated. The chapel is an engine of interpretation that never reaches a conclusion. And while the world stares at Roslin's walls, no one asks what else the Sinclairs built. No one surveys the coastline the Sinclair fleet would have reached. No one maps the quiet, overlooked places where something might have been left behind rather than carved in stone for visitors to find. Roslin may be the most successful decoy in architectural history, not because it hides a secret, but because it makes people feel they are about to discover one. The real question is what was built to never be found at all. The Knights Templar built to last. This was not sentimentality. It was operational doctrine. An organization managing assets across 3 continents needed infrastructure that could survive without continuous human oversight. Fortifications, storehouses, and underground chambers that would remain structurally sound through decades of disuse and abandonment. The evidence is still standing. Beneath the city of Acre in modern Israel, a Templar tunnel stretching over 1,000 feet connects the fortress to the port. Carved through solid rock, vaulted in stone, and still navigable after 8 centuries. At Athlete, south of Haifa, the Templars constructed a castle whose subterranean passages were designed to resist both siege and time. Across Europe, commandery foundations reveal underground chambers built with drainage systems that prevented flooding and deterioration. These were not improvised shelters. They were engineered environments designed to preserve their contents without human intervention. The Templars understood that the greatest threat to a hidden vault was not discovery, but decay. Water infiltration, soil collapse, the slow dissolution of stone. Their construction methods address these threats systematically. The mortar formulas used in Templar foundations incorporate hydraulic lime, a binding agent that hardens in the presence of water rather than weakening. Their drainage channels were angled with precision that modern engineers describe as remarkably sophisticated. Their site selection consistently favored bedrock with low porosity and natural drainage gradients. This was institutional knowledge. It was taught, refined across generations, and deployed wherever the order operated. When the order was dissolved, that knowledge did not vanish. It traveled with the men who carried it. If any group in the 14th century could have built a vault in the bedrock of Nova Scotia, one designed to survive 700 years without maintenance, it was the Templars. The question is not whether they had the capability. The question is whether they had the reason. Consider what 700 years does to a structure. Most medieval buildings have not survived intact. Those that remain standing, cathedrals, castles, fortress walls, have been continuously maintained, repaired, and reinforced by successive generations of builders and caretakers. Without that maintenance, stone cracks, mortar fails, roofs collapse, and water enters. Within a few centuries, an unmaintained building becomes indistinguishable from the landscape around it. But underground construction follows entirely different rules. A chamber cut into bedrock does not need a roof. The rock above it serves that function. It does not need exterior walls. The surrounding geology provides them. If the chamber is positioned above the water table and the bedrock is stable, the primary forces of degradation, weather, vegetation, and mechanical erosion, are dramatically reduced. Underground structures can persist in recognizable form for millennia. Egyptian tombs, Roman catacombs, Mycenaean Tholos chambers. The archaeological record is rich with subterranean spaces that survived precisely because they were below the surface and out of reach. Now apply this to Nova Scotia. The bedrock of Mahone Bay is predominantly slate and gray rock, dense, durable, metamorphic stone with low permeability. A chamber excavated into this rock, properly sealed and positioned above tidal influence, would experience almost no structural degradation over 7 centuries. The climate helps rather than hinders. Frozen ground in winter reduces water infiltration during the season when freeze-thaw cycles would otherwise crack exposed stone. A Templar vault built in this geology would not crumble. It would not flood, assuming the builders understood tidal hydrology, and their documented engineering at Acre and Athlet confirms they did. It would simply sit in the dark, intact, waiting. The uncomfortable implication is straightforward. If such a vault exists in Mahone Bay, and no evidence has been found to prove it does, then the reason it has not been discovered is not that it has deteriorated beyond recognition. It is that no one has looked in the right place. Survival is not the obstacle. Attention is. There is a distinction the Oak Island narrative has never properly made, and it changes everything once you see it. Something that is lost has no guardian. Its location is unknown because knowledge of it has been broken through death, disaster, or the erosion of memory. Discovery is a matter of chance. You stumble upon it or you do not. There is no design behind its concealment, only the accumulated forgetting of time. Something that is hidden is different. Its location is unknown because someone made it unknown deliberately, with foresight and with misdirection, designed to ensure that even those who search will search in the wrong place. Discovery is not chance. It is a matter of overcoming a system built to prevent it. The Oak Island narrative has always treated the money pit as something lost, a vault whose location is known but whose contents remain inaccessible. 2 centuries of excavation have operated on this assumption. The problem is depth. The problem is water. The problem is technical. But what if the money pit is not a lost vault? What if it is part of a hiding system designed by people who understood that the most effective way to protect a secret is to make everyone believe they already know where it is? The Templars did not lose things. They hid them. Their methods involved not single acts of burial, but networks of misdirection, false trails, symbolic decoys, compartmented knowledge ensuring no single person could reveal the whole system. If the money pit is a hiding mechanism rather than a lost vault, then Oak Island has been functioning exactly as designed for over 200 years. Every expedition, every drill, every camera lowered into dark water has played the role the builders intended. The searchers are not failing. They are performing. And the thing that was actually hidden, the real vault, if it exists, remains somewhere in the silence that 2 centuries of noise was constructed to protect. The distinction between hidden and lost is not academic. It is the difference between a mystery that resists solution and a system working perfectly. There is an island next to Oak Island that almost no one talks about. Its name is Birch Island, and it sits so close to Oak Island's eastern shore that, at low tide, You could cross the channel between them in a rowboat in under a minute. The two islands share the same water, the same geology, the same tidal rhythms. Birch Island has no money pit. It has no television show. It has no excavation history of any kind. What it does have, visible in aerial photographs dating back decades, is a large, clearly defined triangular clearing on its surface. The triangle is geometrically precise, distinctly bounded, and oriented in a way that does not correspond to any natural clearing pattern produced by wind, fire, or vegetation die-off. The triangle has been noted by researchers. It has been photographed from above. It has been mentioned in passing by investigators working on Oak Island. And then consistently the conversation moves on. No archaeological survey has been conducted on Birch Island. No permit has been filed. No ground-penetrating radar has been deployed. No core sample has been taken. The formation sits in plain sight on the island closest to Oak Island, and it has been treated as though it does not exist. The reasons for this neglect are never stated explicitly. Birch Island is not Oak Island, and therefore it falls outside the narrative, the permits, and the funding structure that governs the search. But a triangular clearing on the island nearest to the most famous treasure site in the Western Hemisphere demands a question. Why has no one walked across that triangle and asked what lies beneath it? Ground-penetrating radar is not a new technology. It has been commercially available since the 1970s and used extensively in archaeological surveys worldwide. It works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and recording reflections that return. When those pulses encounter changes in subsurface density, voids, walls, buried objects, shifts in soil composition, it is non-invasive, inexpensive, and capable of revealing structures several meters below the surface without turning a single shovelful of earth. GPR has been deployed on Oak Island itself multiple times by multiple teams across multiple decades. The results have contributed to the ongoing narrative of the money pit, confirming voids, identifying anomalies, providing data that feeds the next season of excavation. The technology works. It has proven its value on Oak Island repeatedly, and yet GPR has almost never been systematically deployed on the island surrounding Oak Island. The surveys conducted in the broader Mahone Bay area have been limited in scope, inconsistent in methodology, and, most critically, selective in what has been published and what has been quietly archived. This selectivity is not necessarily conspiratorial. It may simply reflect the economics of attention. GPR surveys require funding. Funding follows interest. Interest follows narrative. And the narrative has been fixed on Oak Island for so long that the surrounding landscape has become functionally invisible to the instruments that could reveal its secrets. But consider what this means in practice. There are islands within sight of Oak Island, islands with anomalous surface features, unexplained clearings, unusual soil patterns that have never been scanned with technology that is routine and readily available. The data that might confirm or deny subsurface construction on those islands simply does not exist because no one has collected it. This is not a gap in knowledge. It is a gap in effort. And the distinction matters enormously because a gap in knowledge implies that the answer is unavailable. A gap in effort implies that the answer is available but unclaimed. The radar exists. The islands exist. The question is why they have never been introduced to each other. If a Templar-era vault were buried beneath one of the islands in Mahone Bay, what would the surface look like 700 years later? This is not a speculative question. It is an applied one, and the tools to answer it already exist. Remote sensing, the analysis of satellite imagery, aerial photography, and multispectral data, has been used for decades to identify buried archaeological structures across the world. Roman roads in Britain, lost cities in the Sahara, irrigation networks beneath the Cambodian jungle. The principle is consistent. Subsurface disturbance leaves surface signatures, even centuries after the original construction. The signatures are subtle but identifiable. Vegetation grows differently over buried stone than over undisturbed soil. Roots reach shallower. Moisture retention changes. In certain plant species, thrive or fail in patterns that trace the outline of what lies below. Drainage shifts when underground chambers alter the flow of groundwater. Soil compaction above a sealed vault produces thermal signatures visible in infrared imaging that differ from the surrounding terrain. These are not theoretical indicators. They are established markers used by professional archaeologists in routine survey work. And several islands in Mahone Bay display precisely these kinds of anomalies, vegetation patterns that do not match prevailing conditions, drainage disruptions with no obvious surface cause, soil composition shifts visible in publicly available satellite data. None of these anomalies have been formally investigated. They appear in imagery that anyone with an internet connection can access. They have been noted by independent researchers and discussed in scattered publications. But no academic institution has ever conducted a systematic remote sensing survey of Mahone Bay's islands with the specific question of subsurface construction in mind. The evidence may already be visible. It may already be recorded in data sitting on servers waiting for someone to ask the right question. The vault, if it exists, may not be invisible at all. It may simply be unrecognized, hiding not in darkness but in plain sight in data that no one has yet thought to read. There is a version of the Oak Island story that no one involved in the search has any financial incentive to tell. It goes like this. The mystery has already been solved, not by discovery, but by economics. Oak Island is no longer merely an archaeological site. It is a media property. The television series built around the Lagina brothers' search has run for over a decade, generating substantial revenue through advertising, licensing, merchandise, and tourism that flows directly into Nova Scotia's local economy. The island has become a destination. The mystery has become a brand. None of this is inherently corrupt. The Lagina brothers appear genuinely motivated by curiosity. The production company is doing what production companies do. The provincial government benefits from the tourist dollars. Everyone involved has legitimate reasons for wanting the search to continue. But that is precisely the problem. The economic structure surrounding Oak Island is optimized for continuation, not resolution. A solved mystery has no second season. A confirmed empty pit generates no advertising revenue. A definitive answer, whether it reveals treasure or confirms its absence, ends the revenue cycle, sustaining an entire ecosystem of jobs, contracts, permits, and media deals. No one needs to conspire to keep the mystery alive. The incentive structure does the work entirely on its own. Investigations that might lead too quickly to conclusion are not actively suppressed. They are simply not funded. Questions that point away from Oak Island are not censored. They are simply not asked on camera. This does not mean the people involved are dishonest. It means they operate within a system whose survival depends on the absence of an answer, and systems that depend on unanswered questions tend over time to stop asking the questions most likely to produce answers. The most dangerous question for Oak Island is not what lies beneath it. It is what happens to the industry built on top of it if someone finds out. The search for whatever lies beneath Oak Island is governed by a legal framework that most viewers never see and most researchers never question. That framework is the permit system, government-issued authorizations determining who can dig, where they can dig, and what they are allowed to disturb. On Oak Island itself, exploration permits have been maintained continuously by the current rights holders. These permits are specific and detailed. They define precise geographic boundaries, allowable methods, reporting requirements, and environmental constraints. Within those boundaries, the search proceeds with full legal authority, but the boundaries end at the shoreline. The permits that govern Oak Island exploration do not extend to adjacent islands. They do not cover the seabed between islands. They do not authorize excavation, survey, or even systematic surface examination of Birch Island, Frog Island, Apple Island, or any of the hundreds of other land masses in Mahone Bay. Each would require its own separate permit application, its own environmental review, its own institutional sponsor, and its own funding stream. In practice, this means the search area has been legally defined as Oak Island and Oak Island alone. Not because the surrounding territory has been investigated and cleared, but because no one has applied for permission to look anywhere else. The permit structure functions as an invisible wall, not blocking access through prohibition, but through the sheer administrative friction of starting a new process from zero. This is not a conspiracy. It is bureaucracy, but the effect is indistinguishable from deliberate containment. The most famous treasure hunt in history has been conducted within boundaries that exclude the very locations this documentary has been building toward. And those boundaries were drawn not by evidence, but by paperwork. If the real vault is not on Oak Island, if it sits beneath a neighboring island or under the shallow waters of the bay, then the permit system has accomplished something no flood tunnel ever could. It has made the most important ground in Mahone Bay legally untouchable, simply by ensuring that no one ever filed the paperwork to touch it. In the entire modern history of Oak Island exploration, spanning decades of organized, well-funded, technologically sophisticated investigation, one document has never been produced. One form has never been submitted. One formal request has never been made. No formal archaeological permit application has ever been filed for a comprehensive survey of the island surrounding Oak Island. Not for Birch Island with its unexplained triangle, not for Frog Island, not for Apple Island, not for any of the hundreds of unnamed land masses scattered across Mahone Bay within direct sight of the money pit. Ajay, the most basic step in any serious archaeological investigation, surveying the surrounding landscape for broader context, has simply never been taken. This is not an oversight caused by ignorance. The people who have spent their lives investigating Oak Island know that Mahone Bay contains hundreds of other islands. They know that some display anomalous features. They have access to the resources and the institutional connections necessary to file for broader survey permits, and yet none of them have done it. The absence of this document is perhaps the most revealing silence in the entire Oak Island story. It is not suppression. No government agency has forbidden the application. No corporate interest has blocked it. The permit simply does not exist because no one has chosen to create it. There is a word for a failure of imagination so consistent, so perfectly aligned with the economic and narrative interests sustaining the current search that it begins to resemble something other than accident. This documentary will not name that something. It does not need to. The question that has never been formally asked whether the real construction lies on an island other than Oak Island, remains unfiled, unfunded, and unanswered. Every year that passes without that filing is another year the system works exactly as designed. Whether anyone designed it is a different question entirely. Consider for a moment the shape of what is not there. No vault has been found beneath Oak Island. No treasure has been recovered. No definitive artifact has been pulled from the money pit that confirms what it was built to contain. Mighty 2 centuries of searching have produced ambiguity, not answers, fragments, theories, and an ever-deepening hole that returns nothing final. This is the negative space at the center of the Oak Island story, and it is usually treated as a problem to be solved, a failure to be corrected by better technology, deeper drilling, more money. But negative space has a shape, and when you step back far enough, the shape becomes visible. No comprehensive archaeological survey has been conducted on the islands surrounding Oak Island. No permit has been filed. No GPR scan has been deployed on Birch Island or its triangle. No academic institution has examined the sonar anomalies recorded beneath the waters of Mahone Bay. No remote sensing analysis has been applied to the vegetation patterns on neighboring land masses. No one has walked the triangle with instruments in hand. Each of these absences, taken individually, can be explained by funding limitations, bureaucratic friction, or simple lack of interest. Taken together, however, they form a pattern that is considerably harder to dismiss. The negative space is not random, it is directional. Every absence points away from the same set of locations. The islands and waters immediately adjacent to Oak Island that have never been examined with any rigor whatsoever. This is not proof of a Templar vault. Negative evidence does not prove anything, but it describes a boundary, a perimeter of uninvestigation that surrounds Oak Island on every side. Inside that perimeter, attention is total and relentless. Outside it, attention drops to zero. And no one has ever offered a satisfying explanation for why the boundary exists where it does. The negative space does not answer the question, but it does reveal with uncomfortable clarity that the question has never been properly asked. Let us, for a moment, hold the full hypothetical in place without flinching and without endorsing it. If the Knights Templar, or any organized group with equivalent resources, maritime capability, and knowledge of underground construction, arrived in Mahone Bay sometime after 1307, they would have found an environment almost perfectly suited to their needs. Hundreds of islands scattered across a sheltered bay, dense forest cover on every shore, stable bedrock beneath shallow soil, a coastline so deeply fragmented that any single island could be reached and departed without observation from any other. If such a group intended to conceal something permanently, they would not have buried it in the most obvious location. They would have built a decoy, a structure elaborate enough to absorb centuries of attention, complex enough to resist easy dismissal, and empty enough to ensure that no discovery would ever end the search. They would have placed the real vault elsewhere, somewhere close enough to monitor from the decoy site, somewhere geologically suitable for long-term preservation, somewhere with no reason for anyone to dig. If the vault was built into bedrock on one of the surrounding islands, sealed with Templar engineering, positioned above the water table, yet concealed beneath natural vegetation that would reclaim the surface within a generation, it would have survived. 7 centuries of undisturbed geology would not have compromised it. The climate would have preserved it. The sheer absence of human attention would have protected it more effectively than any flood tunnel ever constructed. This is the hypothesis. It is unproven. No physical evidence confirms it. No document supports it. No excavation has revealed it. But here's what matters. No excavation has contradicted it either. No survey of the surrounding islands has returned results that rule out subsurface construction. No investigation has been conducted that could falsify the hypothesis, because no investigation of the right locations has ever been attempted. The vault is not disproven, it is untested. And the difference between those two things is the difference between an answered question and one that has never been asked. This documentary has not proven that a Templar vault exists somewhere in Mahone Bay. It has not identified a location. It has not produced an artifact. It has not solved the mystery of Oak Island, and it has no intention of pretending otherwise. What it has done is trace the outline of a silence. For over 200 years, every expedition to Oak Island has followed the same logic. Go deeper, dig further into the same island, down the same shaft, through the same flooded tunnels. Generation after generation has repeated this pattern, each one inheriting the previous generation's assumptions, along with its maps and its certainty. The direction has never changed. The surrounding landscape, hundreds of islands, miles of coastline, an entire bay has been left in a studied neglect that no one has been required to justify. The money pit has consumed every resource, every theory, every dollar, and every life that has been offered to it, and it has returned nothing definitive. Not because the searchers were incompetent, but because the structure may have been designed to do precisely this, to absorb attention so completely that the space around it becomes invisible. If the Templars hid something in Mahone Bay, they did not hide it the way we expect things to be hidden. They did not simply bury it and hope no one would find the spot. They built a system, a mechanism of controlled attention, a lock, not on a door, but on a direction. And for 2 centuries, the lock has held. The mystery of Oak Island is not a mystery of depth. It is a mystery of direction. Every searcher has stood on the same shore, faced the same hole, and asked the same question. This documentary ends by asking a different one. What if the most important thing the Templars concealed was not an object buried in the earth, but a direction? And we have been facing the wrong way for 229 years. The screen holds on the dark water of Mahone Bay. The other islands wait. The question remains unfiled. No answer is given.